All right, welcome back. And what I want to continue talking about now is about learning Ruby. So we have two course textbooks. We have a database textbook, which we'll get to momentarily. We also have this textbook, Engineering Software as a Service. You'll see me abbreviate it as ESAAS. The authors like to drop the E and just use SAS for Software as a Service, but the title is Engineering, and I like to include that. Anyways, they're chapter 2 in the textbook, which is in Learn. It's freely available as a PDF. It provides a quick overview of the differences between Ruby and languages like Java and Python. It's a quick overview. And it's also written a bit at the level of you really understanding some stuff about programming languages. And you already do. But I sense a little bit that someone like myself, just like the authors who have more than 2 decades of experience working with programming languages. Oh, yeah, I read that. Oh, that makes sense to me. And in fact, it makes a lot of sense to me after I have learned Ruby. As I read it, or if I remember when I read it the first time, it was kind of like, what is this all about? And it was too fast, too condensed for me to absorb the knowledge there. So if it works for you, great. You're a very sophisticated reader. All right, you know a lot about programming languages already, and it's not really a problem for you. That's great. You don't have much to read then. If you're like me though, and it doesn't make as much sense as you'd like it to on your first read, you're going to really find yourself reading again a book like Head First Ruby. You're going to find yourself also turning to the Ruby programming language, which is a much more formally written book about Ruby by the actual creators of the Ruby programming language. And then I actually find it can be good to flip between these. But yeah, if you're offended by all the pictures and the examples, and which I actually think makes it engaging and easier to read, of Head First Ruby, just turn over to the more formal the programming language, Ruby is programming language book. And it also takes an approach that's very akin to what I talked about in the previous lecture, like how to learn a programming language. Well, first we need to learn about how to make strings and numbers. What's the basic syntax? And then let's get into the higher level concepts. Absolutely, this follows that approach. It assumes you already know all about computer programming languages. Whereas Head First Ruby is actually kind of nice because it kind of starts you off like, I want to teach you how to program again. Not that you need to learn how to program again, but that style, I find it's actually really digestible. It just goes down nicely. Anyways, today what I want to talk about is some of the important gotchas that I note when I look at chapter 2 and I go, yeah, we should actually mention these to you so you're aware of them so that you don't slip between the cracks. So I do absolutely recommend working with these books, but you should give chapter 2, it's not very long, a read. It'll highlight things that you need to know. It also has some nice sort of summary tables of syntax elements, of language usage. That's really quite handy as a nicely packaged bundle for learning Ruby. But I want to mention some things about Ruby, and then I want to get into some of its trickier features for you that I think we should actually talk about in depth. I want to talk about the use of named parameters. I want to talk about blocks. And probably in another lecture, we'll actually get to this notion of duck typing. Anyways, so continuing on, some things to note about Ruby. All right. So we'll just call this Ruby notes. Some gotchas or something. All right. be aware that you need to get in the habit, actually in Ruby, of using Snakecase. So it's all lowercase with underscores separating the words you want to do for variables, and not to use camel case. Except you'll hear in just a moment an exception to this. Why? What's convention? You're like, is it required? And the answer is no. But when we get to Rails, so the web framework that we use with Ruby, Rails sticks to this convention in a very strong way. So you got to get in the habit of Snakecase for your variables. Otherwise, you're going to end up getting yourself confused and burned once we move to Rails. Likewise, anyone who reads your Ruby code is like, what are you doing? You got to adopt the culture of the new language, and Ruby's got a lot of culture to it. So Snakecase for your variable names. Don't use camel case, except classes. So when you define a class, classes must start with a capital letter. All right, now, since they all start with a capital letter, this basically means use camel case for classes. And that's the convention that you're going to see when we get to Rails as well. All right. Something to note about Ruby, you may have already noticed it, is that it is what we call a dynamically typed language rather than a statically typed language. Remember the types that you have in Java, like int and double? Okay, so those are specific types, and Java is a statically typed language. When we make a variable in Java, and we make it an int variable, an integer variable, or a double variable for floating point double precision values, that variable is forever an int, or is forever a double. So static means it never changes. Dynamically typed means the variable doesn't give a hoot about whether it is an int, a double, a string, everything in Ruby is an object, and so variables just simply hold references to objects, and they don't care what type of object it is that they hold on to. Okay, so a variable, again, can hold a reference to any type of object. And this is really different than what you were used to in Java, where types are critical. You're not allowed to, if you have an int variable, you can't put a string in an int variable. No, absolutely not. Here, doesn't matter. One port in your code, you could put an integer in there. Next, you could put a double. Next, you could put a string. Next, you could put a hash table. Ruby doesn't care. Now, people reading your code might go, what in the world are you doing? So don't abuse this. Just remember that you're free. Now, you don't have to go around naming the types of your variables. But unfortunately, you do need to be aware of what's in that variable, what it's holding a reference to, and basically because different types can respond to different commands on them. So, again, they're all objects, so they all can have method calls to them. But different objects will respond to different methods. So you can't just like willy-nilly do it. What will happen in a dynamically typed language when you screw up is when you run the program, it'll go, oh, no such method on that type of object. And you go, oh. Basically, you've got some object in that variable and you're trying to treat it like another type of object. but that object doesn't know that method that you called on it. And so it goes, I can't do that. And you've got what's called a runtime error. So whereas Java will catch those at compile time. So when you do a compile of your Java code and you've got all these static types, it makes sure that you're playing nicely with your types and you're not doing something stupid. If you're doing something stupid, it goes, I will not compile that for you, and gives you an error. Ruby doesn't compile your code. So at the time it runs, and if it works, it works. If it doesn't work, you'll get a runtime error and your program will quit on you. So that's a really big difference and something to keep in mind. There is this wild thing in Ruby that does not exist in Java. The notion of symbols. All right. And so you can make a symbol, for example, colon, you have a colon, and then it will use this word alpha. So this defines the symbol, and the symbol is colon alpha. I mean, that's what it is. I mean, I could make another one, colon mark. That's the symbol mark, okay? Something important to know is that symbols are not strings, okay? A string is made up of characters. Made up of characters. A symbol is not. I mean, you write it with characters, A, L, M, A, R, K, but it's not made up of symbols. We can't ask, what is the first character of this symbol? It's not a string. It's just a symbol. So it's basically, this is one unique sort of identifier. And so we can pass around colon mark, and it means colon mark only. It's just, it's basically like getting a unique random number, except they're not numbers. It's a symbol. So it's a unique identifier that we can then use. So you could use, you can use it as a key in a hash table. We're going to see that the language itself asks for you to give it symbols, and so forth and so on. And so we're going to see a lot of symbols also when we get to Rails. Rails can be a little sloppy of turning symbols and strings back and forth, but we should know that symbols are not strings and strings are not symbols, and we should treat them separately. It's basically, you might very well find yourself when you're coding that sometimes you want to make something like a hash, and you want to record, oh yeah, the key is Mark, and then, oh, Mark has a value of 42. Well, instead of using a string as that key, you can use a symbol. Why? Why should you do this? It's taken from the language Lisp and Scheme. It's something that those programmers liked. Obviously, the creator of the Ruby programming language sort of liked that, felt that it was useful. I gotta tell you, it has marginal usage in my mind. You can read about it online. People are like, oh, this has the potential for some performance improvements, but that's ridiculous. Not a gigantic change there. Just know that the language has them and people use them. And you're going to have to use them to talk to a lot of Rails and other Ruby things. Whether or not you start using them in your code or not is entirely up to you for your own purposes, but you need to be aware, but they're not strings. They form a unique identifier. All right. So it's a unique identifier that you can store in a variable. All right. You can put them in a variable. All right. So what else do we need to know? By the way, you're going to come across this when you read about classes. So I don't really have to tell you this, but the instance variables inside of classes, they are not public. They're not publicly available. They're hidden, okay? And so if you were in Java, we would talk about you writing getters and setters. So methods to get the value and write the value if we want to set the value if we want to be able to access them from outside the class. So basically Ruby is by default saying you can't do this. We're not going to let you have your class innards be exposed. We're going to make it so that you have to always go through methods to access the state, the instance variables of your class. We want you to have better programming practices. Now, they do go and give you some methods to help you with this. You can do this automatically. So you can get getters and setters default created for you if you don't want anything special. If you want to do something with like a setter, so one of the reasons we like to have a setter is, let's say when someone sets a value inside of a class, we want to make sure that they're setting it to a legal value within a certain range. And so we can put a check on that. And if they're not, we can raise an exception and be mad at them. But if you don't have any need to just check it, you just want them to be able to set it, or you just want them to be able to read a value from you, there are some automatic methods, and so and you can check them out and read about. For example, there's the ATRA reader, and we could say, colon, like weight. Okay, so I've got some class, and inside of the class, when I define it, I go ATRA underscore reader, and I use one of these symbols. Okay, this is one of those interesting things where Ruby can take the symbol and it will create for us an instance variable inside of our class named weight. So within the class, we will refer to @weight to be able to access this instance variable, because remember, instance variables inside classes are they start with the @ symbol. Anyways, but now other people from outside the class will be able to read and get the value of our instance variable automatically. There'll be a method created called weight on the class so that they can actually get that. When you read the chapter in Headfirst Ruby about classes, you'll get this, you'll see this. Just be aware, something to know. Don't just try to use, in other words, you're going to have to read stuff. You can't just always just try and hope it'll work the way you expect. Because you're going to run into all sorts of things like, that's not working. Yeah, it's not, because you didn't read how to do it first. You got to at least skim over these instructions. All right. So we can also have static methods. And you may very well have forgotten about these from 121 and 240. It's a real problem. They are taught, but they're easy to forget. You can have static methods on class, and you define them as follows. So let's say, we have class alpha, and inside of class alpha we want a static method called search. So we go def, and instead of just search, instead of defining the method, we do self.search. right, and let's say we pass in some sort of query. You know, we have some code and this is, you know, who knows, there's all sorts of other stuff probably written inside the class. This wouldn't be very good anyway, but this then allows us, it's on the class, and so in code we would call alpha.search, you know, hello, whatever, pass in some string. All right, so note, that's the class name, and we're calling the method on the class name. So this is a static method on the class. The method exists on the actual class itself. It hasn't been created to be used as part of alpha objects. So again, we could make an alpha object with alpha.new, and that would give us an alpha object. But here we have the actual class, and we're calling this. So there are times when we want static methods. We're primarily going to see us using a fair amount of static methods when we get to Rails. Note this, pay attention to it when you read the books. All right. So named parameters. All right. So this is a really neat thing. You may have seen this when you've dealt with the R programming language. So methods can have named parameters. And part of the reason you need to know about this is when you use libraries and other code written by people that have used named parameters, you have to use the named parameters. But you can use them in your own programming as well. So they can have named parameters and they can have default values. And this is really handy and neat. So example, we can have a method, you know, imagine we call some method tax. We're going to compute some, let's say, a tax on something. And so we can say we're going to have a parameter called price. That's great. If I was to just write price, and let's say we're working in the United States, and so we have zip codes rather than postal codes, and taxes change a lot based upon your zip code, depending on what state you're in, what city, and so forth. You could have this. Now, these are not named parameters. These are called positional parameters. So the position of my arguments matters. So if I was to call tax, you know, and I call tax with 10, and let's say we pass in zips as strings, you know, 98010. All right. So I pass in the number 10 and a string for the zip code. It's the position. I place the 10. So price becomes 10 when I'm inside my method of tax. 98010 becomes the zip code for, becomes the zip. So inside of this method, zip will be equal to that string. That's what you're used to. That's what's going on in Java, okay? So there's nothing new about positional parameters. That's what you already know all about. Oh, so what about these named parameters? Oh, okay, well, what we can do is we can take this same definition and then we put a colon after the parameters. So no space. So no space between it. By the way, I want to note, if you are dyslexic, things like this in Ruby drive you mad. Or, you know, I got a little bit of dyslexia in my family. It's doesn't affect me much, but I will tell you, you know, we just talked about symbols, and symbols are a colon, you know, with some word after it. And here we've got a word with a colon after it. It's like, what? It's not the same thing. This is not a symbol. This is a special way to declare a name. These are named parameters now for the tax method. All right, so now when we could call tax as follows. And in fact, when we make named parameters, we now need to use the names of those parameters in the call. But because it's no longer positional, it doesn't matter what order we put them in. Okay, so now we do zip colon, and I can pass in, 98010. Anyways, and then we can do price colon and 10. So note the big difference. With a positional argument, again, it matters what order you have them in. Here, it doesn't matter because we are putting and saying the zip is this and the price is this when we call the method tax. Thus, that's pretty cool. The other really cool thing about named parameters is when you read this code, so you're reading someone's code, you can now see, oh, tax, so they're passing in a zip and a price. Ah, wow. Compare that to when we had the other one where we called, tax 10,98010. All right. Maybe the 10 is a price. I don't know. Maybe this is a zip code if you recognize things as zip codes. But this allows the call to be much better documented. Also, again, you don't have to memorize what's the order and line things up. You just got to make sure that you use all the required arguments. All right. What's this whole business about default arguments? All right. Let's say if you wanted to make the zip actually optional, we could, by the way, actually provide it with, let's say we make it optional and its default value is nil. So now people could call tax. They still need to say price. They could pass in the 10, but they don't need to pass in the zip because the zip will be given a value of nil. Or, of course, we could have made the default something else. Let's say we wanted to just have it by default be 98010 or whatever. We could do that. So you can have notions of a value that gets assigned to a parameter when you call the method if the person doesn't supply a parameter value for it. It's handy. It's absolutely handy. If you take a look in R, it has the same thing, and you've probably run into it there. All right. And I'm just going to say one last thing. Do not use globals. Some students, for some reason, go, I got to get my code to work. I have to use global variables. You don't need to use global variables. So if you use global variables in your code, these are things with $signs and stuff. We're going to take off points and be mad at you. Like, don't use global variables. You know not to use global variables. Okay, don't do that. So don't use globals. Okay. Finally, some other things. One last thing is this notion of poetry mode. Okay. In Ruby, you're going to see a lot of this. So this is all about not using parentheses on method calls. Oh, I mean, it's kind of mind-boggling. So like that former method, we could do tax, and let's say I had the positional arguments. I could do tax 10, 98010. Woo! Where are my parentheses? In Ruby, you get to write things in poetry mode. Why do they call it poetry mode? Because it reads like poetry. I think that's baloney that it reads like poetry. I think it reads confusingly. So look, you're coming from Java. Don't make your life too hard. Feel free to use your parentheses as you would like to, okay? If it helps you to be in poetry mode, or it just makes programming fun or more enjoyable, get rid of your parentheses. But I will warn you that there are times when you write code and you try to use poetry mode and Ruby goes, it runs and it has an error. It goes, and you're like, oh, what's wrong? And you spend this time and you're like, what's wrong? I can't figure out, what did I do wrong? What did I do wrong? And it's just because it can't figure out. You've done something more complex than just a simple method call. You're mixing all sorts of stuff. And it's like, it can't figure out where the parentheses are supposed to be. And so it can't actually run. It can't figure out what you've written. And then you waste this time. So if in doubt, use parentheses, okay? It'll probably save you some time. But you're going to see lots of code and examples online where it is written in poetry mode, and you're going to wonder, what is that? What's going on? And it's poetry mode. So you have to be aware of it because other people are going to use it all over the place in Ruby. So those are some high-level things that I really wanted to cover, some gotchas that I saw when looking through the Engineering Software as a Service Chapter 2 in some of the first sections of material there. Next, I want to talk about using blocks and duck typing, but I think I'm going to leave that to another lecture. All right,